The desert was not quiet that evening. It rarely ever was. Wind dragged its fingers over the low brush, rattling the brittle bones of last season's weeds, carrying grit that scoured a man's face until he felt carved from stone himself. Elias Boon trudged a narrow trail toward his cabin with the same weariness he always wore. A tired mule trailed behind with 2 sacks of cornmeal slung across its back. His boots had long ago given up the comfort of soles. Leather flaps dragged in. The dust, patched with rope where nails had once been. His shirt clung damply to his skin, sweat making dark patterns down his chest, and his hat brim sagged with a GKO anyone watching. He looked the image of a man too poor to stand proud, too ragged to be noticed. But Elias had grown used to that. He walked with his eyes steady on the horizon, never asking for pity, never expecting more than the company of silence. The horizon that evening was painted in a bruise of color, purples and reds bruising the line of low mesas. Then came the sound. Hoofbeats? No, softer, faster. Footfalls that he stopped, mule grunting behind him, and turned toward the flats just as 2 figures sprinted into view. Women. One younger, swift and wild as a desert fox, her long black hair in braids that whipped behind her. The other older, calmer, her dark eyes already scanning Elias with precise calculation even as she ran. Then came the arrows. They hissed past, sharp whispers of death. One buried itself in the sand beside Elias's boot. The next struck his shoulder. Before he even realized it had been aimed at him, he staggered. The pain arrived slow, first a distant throb, then a roar like fire crawling up bone. His knees buckled, mule braying in alarm, cornmeal spilling into the dirt. Strong hands gripped him. The older woman, Naeli, though he wouldn't learn her name until later, hauled him off the trail with a strength that didn't match her size. The younger one, Tala, grabbed the reins and vanished behind a boulder. Arrows still hissed. One skipped off stone inches from Elias's head. He should have stayed down. Should have crawled or cowered or let the desert claim him. Instead, some old spark inside him flared to life that he reached for the mule's harness, pulling it low beside them. The cornmeal wasn't worth spit now, but that mule was all he had. He pressed his good hand over the bleeding wound. His eyes met Naeli's for a single second, her breath ragged, face smeared with dust and sweat, eyes wide with fury and fear. He nodded. Didn't know why. Maybe to tell her he'd help. Maybe just to say he was still here. The next arrow never came. Silence returned as suddenly as it had shattered. They waited, still, breath held, pulse thudding in Elias's ears like war drums. Nothing. Tala emerged, chin high, bow now in her hands. Her young face was tense, but she said nothing, just stared at Elias like he was something new. Without a word, Naeli ripped open his shirt and examined the wound. Not gently, not cruelly either, just like someone who'd done this before. Elias winced, but didn't pull away. His vision swam. Cabins 1/2 mile, he rasped. Tala nodded once. Then she took the mule's lead. Naeli draped his arm over her shoulder and lifted. Elias didn't remember walking. Just the grit in his mouth, the pressure in his skull, and the way her fingers never shook, not once. The cabin crouched like a secret in the folds of stone and dust, half swallowed by sagebrush and shadow. Elias hadn't meant for it to become a tomb, but that's what it had been for years now. A place where time got trapped and hope leaked. Out slow, like rain through a bad roof. Naeli helped him over the threshold without ceremony. Tala followed with the mule, eyes scanning every angle like she expected more arrows to come slicing out of the dusk. The inside was worse than the outside. 2 chairs, both with a leg shortened by age. A table Elias had made himself back when he thought a woman might sit at it someday. One cot against the wall with an old army blanket folded neat, as if he were expecting a guest who never showed. No food smell, no warmth, just the dry stink of old canvas and sun-baked earth. Noelle eased him down onto the cot. Her hands worked, with strange grace, like a midwife or a butcher, cutting his shirt the rest of the way open and exposing the wound. She didn't flinch at the dried blood, didn't pause when he hissed as her fingers touched the shaft. "You speak English?" Elias grunted. Noelle didn't answer. Her eyes flicked to his, sharp and silent, then back to the task. She poured something dark from a leather pouch, thick and bitter-smelling, and packed it around the arrow's entrance. Elias clenched his jaw. "Ain't much here," he muttered, his voice low and ashamed. "Didn't expect company." Still nothing. Tala appeared in the doorway, holding his only tin bowl, now full of water. She handed it off without a word and moved to the window. A girl of maybe 17, maybe 20, he couldn't tell. Too young to be that hard. But she moved like she'd never known soft. "Hold him," Noelle said suddenly. Tala obeyed without hesitation, one arm across his chest, the other bracing his wrist. Elias felt like a slab of meat pinned to a table. He tried not to squirm. Noelle gripped the arrow with both hands. Met his eyes. "Breathe." He didn't get the chance to ask why. She yanked. Pain lit his vision white. His back arched, breath stolen from his lungs. Blood gushed, then was stemmed with something that smelled like crushed pine and death. His head swam. His jaw clenched, so tight he thought his teeth might snap. When the world came back, Noelle was stitching the skin closed with what looked like horsehair. Tala had taken up guard at the door again, her silhouette a still blade against the fading sky. "I'm sorry," Elias said, when he could speak. He didn't know what he was apologizing for. The wound, the emptiness of his cabin, the sheer inadequacy of his life. Noelle looked at him for a long time, then finally said, "You let us in." It wasn't praise, wasn't forgiveness either, just a fact. That night, he lay stiff in his cot, arm burning, breath shallow. The roof leaked. In one corner, he heard the plink-plink of rain starting to fall into a rusted pot. He thought they'd sleep near the fire, or what was left of it. But Noelle curled up by the door, blanket wrapped tight, knife within reach. Tala lay against the opposite wall, bow across her chest, eyes open. Elias stared at the ceiling. Two strangers. No food, no comfort, no promises. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. Elias made it to town 4 days later, arms stiff and wrapped in an old bandage that already smelled sour. The sisters stayed behind at the cabin, Tala watching the ridge with her bow, Noelle scraping together what roots and herbs she could find from the dry earth. He told them he'd be quick, he lied. The mercantile stood like a dusty tombstone at the end of Main Street, its paint flaked off like dry skin. Inside, Miss Delia barely glanced at him as he entered, her usual chatter silenced by a glance out the front window. He didn't have to turn around to know someone was already watching. Sheriff Clay Harlan leaned against the hitching post across the street, arms folded, mouth tugged into a smirk. His badge caught the sun like a warning bell. "Look what the cat dragged in." A voice called from inside the store. Elias turned. Two ranch hands, probably from the Kessel property, sons of the same men who'd once worked alongside Elias in better years, grinned like they'd smelled rot. "You ain't looking so good, Boon," one of them said. "Got yourself into a tussle with a cactus, or just wrestlin' with your new house guests?" The other snorted. "Heard you brought home a couple of strays. Dangerous ones." "I don't talk gossip," Elias muttered, reaching for a sack of flour. "No, but you sure know how to invite trouble." Their laughter followed him down the aisle. Delia rang him up without comment. Didn't even say goodbye. She glanced behind him once, nervous. Outside, Harlan straightened as Elias passed. "Word is," the sheriff said, voice low and oily, "you're harboring folks who don't belong here." "That true?" Elias didn't answer. Harlan stepped in front of him. "You best be careful, Boone. Folks around here ain't fond of strangers, especially the kind that bring arrows." Elias stared at him. They were being hunted. So were Buffalo, Harlan said, shrugging. Didn't make 'em neighbors. He walked away like he'd won something. Dust curled around his boots. The ride back home felt longer. Every crunch of gravel under his mule's hooves echoed with the words. Strays, trouble, dangerous. Back at the cabin, Noelle said nothing when she saw the tightness in his jaw. She just took the flour, checked his wound, then went back to drying herbs by the fire. Tala sat sharpening arrowheads in the corner. They know, Elias said finally. Whole damn town. Noelle didn't look up. Of course they do. You still want to stay? Tala glanced up. Do you? He didn't answer. Not at first. That night, he sat outside while the stars turned overhead, feeling the ache in his shoulder and something else deeper, older. The kind of pain that doesn't bleed. A bone deep knowing that every choice from here out would have a cost. When he finally went inside, he slid the latch on the door. It was a quiet decision, but it meant everything. They fell into rhythm not through words, but need. Mornings began before light, the three of them moving around each other like brushstrokes in a painting no one dared name. Elias hauled water from the spring down in the gulch, arms still stiff, but stronger each day. Tala mended the fence posts, her bow never far from reach. Noelle dug narrow trenches along the garden patch and filled them with gathered seed and spit-prayers. One spoke of permanence. But they moved like they belonged. Small things changed first. The door got patched. A strip of Noelle's own leather wrapped the splintered hinge. The mule's bridle got a new knot, tied the way her people did it. Tighter, smarter. Elias's old shirts, once good only for kindling, came back folded, stitched clean across the shoulders with tiny thread patterns. Like snakes or rivers. He didn't know if they meant anything. He wore them anyway. He'd wake to find a few strips of dried meat tucked into the bag he took to town. Or return from chopping wood to see his bow, rest-strung and polished, leaning against the porch rail. The roof still leaked, but now someone was always there to move the pot before it overflowed. Once, late at night, Elias caught himself smiling at the sound of Tala humming while she polished arrows. He hadn't smiled in years, but peace didn't come free. Not out here. It started with a stone. Midday, the sun burning hard, they were sitting in silence. Noelle was grinding herbs. Tala was watching a lizard crawl up the wall. Elias was fixing the hinge on the second chair, finally doing something about its wobble. Then, crash, glass shattered. Elias ducked instinctively. Noelle was already on her feet, knife drawn. Tala dove for her bow. A rock, black and jagged, sat in the middle of the floor. The only window, already cracked, was now a gaping wound in the wall. Elias rushed outside. Nothing, just dust and wind, but someone had stood there. Watched them. Thrown it. He stared at the trail. No tracks, just the whisper of thread in the air. A warning, or a promise. When he came back in, Noelle had already swept the shards into a pile. She met his eyes and nodded once. They didn't fix the window that day, just covered it with burlap and moved the firewood pile against the wall. That night, he expected fear to keep him awake, but it didn't. What kept him up was the way Noelle had stood in front of him without thinking. The way Tala had placed herself between the window and her sister. The way his own chest had gone hot, not with fear, but with something more dangerous. The need to protect. The next morning, he found an old cedar plank and started shaping it to fit the window. It didn't matter that he hadn't used a saw in years. His hands remembered. His spine remembered. He said nothing when Noelle brought him a tin cup of something hot. Just drank it and went back to work. Words weren't needed. Every day that passed, the cabin stopped being a hiding place. It was becoming a home. The fifth time Elias walked into town, he wore one of the mended shirts. Blue thread traced a pattern across the collar. Small, careful work done by hands that never asked permission. The stitching itched, but he didn't scratch. Let the whole damn town see it. Main Street didn't exactly go quiet, but it noticed. Old men on porches stopped rocking. A couple of younger boys leaned into each other and whispered. No one said hello, but Elias didn't expect them to. Not anymore. He tied the mule out front and walked into the mercantile. Miss Delia kept her eyes down this time. Didn't even ask what he needed, just pointed to the flour and beans. He gathered them wordlessly, reached for sugar, stopped, then grabbed coffee instead. It wasn't for him. He hated the bitter stuff. But Niley liked it. The store was crowded today. More than usual. Maybe because of the weather, maybe because of him. Either way, he felt the heat of too many eyes crawling over his shoulders. Then came the voice. Well, I'll be, said Caleb Kessel, stepping out from behind a barrel of pickling salt. Boone finally found someone desperate enough to patch his holes and warm his bed. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp. Elias turned slowly. His pulse didn't spike. His face didn't change. But something old inside him stirred, like a bear in spring, stiff, hungry, dangerous. I heard the older one's a healer, Kessel went on, grinning. Maybe she can fix that limp of yours. And the young one, well, she looks like she could keep a man warm through winter. Elias didn't speak. He didn't have to. He walked forward until they were nose to nose. Not fast, just steady, deliberate. The room tensed. I'll pay for what I take, Elias said quietly. And I'll leave. That's all. Kessel chuckled, but his eyes twitched. You sure you wanna? Elias didn't raise his voice. I don't fight in stores. You know where I live. If you've got something to say to my face, say it there. Silence. Then Kessel stepped back, muttering under his breath. Elias paid and left. He didn't feel strong. He felt tired. But somewhere in the walk back, under the wide bowl of sun and wind, a thought settled on his shoulders and stayed there. He wasn't ashamed anymore. That night, as he unpacked the coffee beans, Noelle gave him a look. Not soft, not smiling, but something close to. He poured her a cup with shaking hands. She took it and, for the first time, placed a hand over his. Just for a moment, that it steadied him more than anything else could have. Later, he stood outside, watching the moon rise. The scars on his hands caught the light. Old burns, rope marks, a few from tools, others from fists. He'd never shown them to anyone, never needed to explain them. They were just part of him. But now, they felt like something earned, proof that he'd survived. He didn't plan to lie down again. The knock came just after noon. 3 slow raps. Not rushed, not uncertain. The kind of knock that carries a badge behind it. Elias set down the fence rail he'd been measuring. Tala already had her bow in hand. Naeli, without a word, stepped inside the cabin, came back with a short blade and tucked it into the back of her skirt. He opened the door slowly. Sheriff Harlan sat tall on his sorrel, flanked by 2 deputies. Dust clung to their boots, and their expressions were carved from the same dry contempt they always wore like armor. Harlan took off his hat, wiped sweat from his brow, then looked past Elias into the gloom of the cabin. Boone, he said, I'm here out of courtesy, not habit. Elias didn't answer. You got 2 women inside who don't belong. This ain't about race. It's about law. They crossed county lines without papers, without clearance. Some say they were part of a raid east of the gulch. That true, Elias said. His voice came out flat. Even, Harlan shrugged. Truth ain't the point. Folks believe it. And belief's a funny thing. It don't wait for facts. It just burns. Nali stepped beside Elias. Silent. Tala moved into view a second later, chin raised, bow unstrung but not by much. That Harlan's eyes tightened. You got 2 choices. Send him back with us, quiet-like. Or we'll come back with warrants and more than just 2 men. No third choice. Elias asked. Harlan smiled. Only if you're real fond of shovels and fire. He turned his horse and rode off. The dust settled slow. Elias shut the door. They didn't speak for a while. Just listened to the ticking of tension that still lingered in the air like gunpowder smoke. Then Nellie picked up a broom and started sweeping the front corner like she hadn't just been threatened with arrest. Tala went back to sorting fletchings. Elias leaned against the wall and tried to remember the last time anyone had stood beside him when the law came knocking, but he couldn't. That night, a storm blew in hard. The kind that tears branches from trees and sets animals to pacing. Wind howled through the gaps in the roof, and rain poured down like God himself wanted them drowned. The patched windows started to leak. The old cedar plank split with a sharp crack. Naeli was up first, grabbing the ladder. Elias joined her, dragging his aching arm along as he hoisted himself up on the roof, soaked and shaking. He held the beam steady while she nailed it down. Tala handed up wood through the hole below, her braid plastered to her back. Lightning split the sky. For a second, Elias saw Naeli's face lit like marble, lips tight, eyes burning. Then darkness swallowed them again. When they finished, they collapsed against the wall. All three of them, side by side, breathing hard in the wet dark. "I'm not letting them take you," Elias said. Naeli turned her head toward him. Her voice came like a stone dropped into still water. "We never expected you to." He didn't realize until then. Neither of them had ever planned to run. They came at dawn. First it was the rumble, distant, steady, like thunder from a clear sky. Elias stood barefoot in the yard, coffee in hand, watching the horizon turn gold. Then the silhouettes rose from the ridge, 12 riders, backlit by the rising sun. Their head rode a tall man on a painted horse. His hair was iron gray and braided down his back, his shoulders draped in a black and red woven cloak. He didn't carry a rifle, he didn't need one. Naeli stepped out beside Elias, face unreadable. Tala followed, fingers tense on her bow. "That's my father," Naeli said simply. Elias exhaled through his nose. "You didn't mention he had an army." "He is the army." The riders didn't charge. They came slow, controlled, like they knew everyone was watching. And they were. From the opposite hill, the townsfolk gathered, some on foot, some on horses. Sheriff Harlan stood front and center, arms crossed. Beside him, Caleb Kessel spat into the dirt. The distance between the two groups was a canyon of silence. Chief Dason brought his horse to a halt a few feet from Elias. He didn't dismount, just stared at the man in front of his daughters. "You sheltered my blood," he said. His voice was low, rough as old leather. "You took a wound meant for them." "I did," Elias said. "You knew who they were?" Elias shook his head. "Didn't matter." Dason's eyes narrowed. "You live alone. Poor. Unarmed. Why risk everything for two strangers?" Elias glanced at Naeli, then back at Dason. "Because it was right." The chief didn't move for a long moment. Then he dismounted with the slow grace of someone who knew every eye was on him. He approached Elias. Close, closer, until they stood chest to chest, breath mingling. "You have no land of value," Dason murmured. "No coin, no tribe, no name that carries weight here." Elias met his gaze. "I've got a roof. I've got hands that still work. And I've got two people under that roof who ain't afraid of the dark anymore." A murmur stirred through the onlookers. Sheriff Harlan's jaw clenched. Kessel muttered something, but no one echoed him this time. Dason stepped back, lifted his hand. One by one, his riders dismounted, formed a line behind him. Naeli and Tala moved forward, shoulders square. Then, to Elias's shock, they both knelt. Dason extended his arm, not in command, but in recognition. "You are kin now," he said, "by blood spilled and bond chosen." He turned toward the townsfolk. "You call my daughters invaders. You call this man a fool. But he stood while you threatened. He bled while you whispered." The silence was a held breath. "I will not forget this." He mounted again. To Elias, he said one final thing. "Your cabin is watched now, not from fear, from respect." Then they turned and rode, dust swirling like smoke behind them. Harlan didn't move, but his power drained out of him like water from a cracked canteen. Later, Elias sat on the porch, shirt clinging to his back, heart still hammering. Nali brought him a bowl of stew and said nothing. Tala placed her bow beside the door and leaned against the frame. Elias looked out over the land and thought, for the first time in years, it finally looked back. The stars were bright that night, brighter than Elias remembered in years. Maybe because there was no longer something pressing down on his chest. Maybe because there was no more waiting for a knock, or a stone, or a hissed threat in the mercantile.or. Maybe, Elias thought, the stars had always been that bright, he'd just forgotten how to look up. The cabin was still the same in shape. 3 walls patched. 1 window boarded, roof nailed half honest. But inside, everything had changed. The air felt lived in, shared. Tala's bow hung over the hearth. Naali's bundles of herbs cured above the door. His tools had been sharpened, organized. The cot now had 2 folded blankets, one of them soft wool with red stitching along the edge. Outside, Elias sat on the porch steps, oil lamp flickering beside him. The desert stretched quiet and long. Coyotes called from somewhere far off, but they didn't sound threatening, just alive. Naali came out with a tin cup. Coffee, of course. She didn't ask if he wanted it, just handed it over and sat beside him. They didn't speak for a long time. You ever think, Elias said finally, how strange it is? That a man can live 40-some years and not feel like he's ever been seen. Not really, until an arrow lands in his chest. Naali smirked, almost smiled. That was a warning shot. Good aim, then. She leaned her shoulder gently against his. The contact was small, but it landed deep. Elias didn't flinch. I'm not sure what to do now, he said quietly. With peace. Same thing you did with pain, Naali murmured. Endure it. He chuckled, then sighed. Harlan hasn't come back. Kessel either. They won't, she said. They had their say. Now they'll chew it in private. And the others? She didn't answer, didn't have to. People had started looking at him different. Not friendly, but less sure of their cruelty. He caught Delia, watching him from behind the glass. A child had waved once. Not much, but something. Elias hadn't chased respect. But somehow, it had come anyway. I thought I'd die out here, he said. Alone. Dirt poor. Unknown. You still might, Naali said. We all might. He looked over. She met his eyes, serious and clear, but not unknown, she added. Not unloved. Tala came out with a blanket and dropped it over their shoulders without a word. Then she sat on the other side of him. All 3 of them stared at the stars. For the first time, Elias felt the weight in his chest ease, not because he was strong or rich or right, but because someone had chosen to sit beside him anyway. That he wasn't just surviving now, that he was living. Whatever came next, he'd meet it with his back straight, his hands steady. And for once, when the desert whispered at dusk, he'd listen without fear.